Okay, so we have that it has been sent to the third party, but it's not yet.
It looks like it's good. I see it now.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, thank you. All right, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us today in the Frontiers in Social Evolution seminar series. My name is Lauren Hayes. I am at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and I'm the host today. I see a lot of new people, so I'm going to quickly sort of just go over how this works. We have about an hour-long talk, after which we'll have discussion. So if you're new, please stick around. The discussion is really where we dig into things, and it's been fantastic discussion so far. And that will last about 45 minutes. So we'll end around 1:45 or so Eastern time. 12:45 Eastern time. Sorry, that won't be that long of a discussion. Yeah, so we really encourage students and postdocs to ask questions during that time. In terms of what we have coming up, so next week, I'll start off with next week. We have another young scholar is going to be joining us. Camille Testard from Harvard University will be talking about neuroethology and sociality and its role in environmental resilience. And I am slated to be the host for that seminar. Looking forward to that. Today we have another young scholar I would call a rising star in the field of behavioral ecology and also conservation biology, is Mikey Pardo, who's currently at Cornell University. Mikey earned his PhD at Cornell and then did a postdoc on an NSF postdoc fellow at Colorado State with George Whittemire. He is his current position I mentioned is another postdoc at Cornell University, and he's currently focusing more on conservation issues, but he said he's going to talk about sort of communication today. I heard of him. I think I was listening to the radio of NPR, or I was reading a CNN story, and that's where I found out about what he's going to talk about today. And I thought, I got to get this guy. And so I'm really excited that he's willing to give a talk today. I'm not going to give any details because the story just piqued my interest, and I don't want to give away what he's going to talk about today. In terms of his training, Mickey is a behavioral ecologist. He thinks about acoustic communication, animal cognition, the evolution of language, and particularly in elephants, which you'll hear about today. He is transitioning and doing some conservation work, as he spoke to me about before today, and also I've seen on his Google Scholar link. He has a number of excellent publications in journals ranging from behavioral ecology to Rock Royal Society B, Current Biology, Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. And as I said, I really got attention from the press that was on one of the papers focusing on elephant communication. And today he is going to be talking to us about elephant vocalization, and his title is Elephant Vocal Communication, a Promising Model for Language Evolution. And with that, thank you, Mickey, for being here with us today, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you've been working on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for the introduction. I'm going to try to share my screen here, make sure we got the sound turned on. Okay, can you all see my screen?
Yes,
cool.
But put it into presenter view if you would, please.
Okay, is it showing presenter view for you?
Yeah, it looks good now. Thank you.
Okay, cool. All right, so yeah, I'm going to talk today about vocal communication in elephants broadly. I'm going to mostly focus on one species, African savanna elephants, because that's the one that we understand the best. But I'll briefly touch on the other species as well. I'm going to sort of present elephants as a potential model for understanding the evolution of language. I think that elephants have been kind of underappreciated in this realm, but I think that there's a lot that they can teach us about how complex communication and language may have evolved. So before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the people who have really been instrumental in making this work possible. So all the work that I'm going to talk about today that I did was in my previous postdoc, which was with George Whittemire at Colorado State University, and in close collaboration with Save the Elephants and the researchers at that organization in Kenya, as well as with Elephant Voices and Joyce Poole, who's another elephant researcher that I've collaborated with a lot, and she provided some of the data that I used as well. And then Kurt Fristrup, also at Colorado State, was a really crucial collaborator for part of the work that I've done as well. So human language is kind of this really interesting and unique behavior that we don't understand that well, and even defining it is kind of challenging. But linguists have identified a number of features that sort of typify human language. And if we want to understand the origins of human language, then looking for analogous features in the communication systems of other species can be a really valuable way to do that. So some of these features, this is not an exhaustive list, but some of these features include the fact that, number one, language is learned. It's what makes language so unique is that it's highly flexible, and that's only possible if we learn the signals. We can't be born with language completely pre-programmed in our brain. There has to be at least some learned component. Two, language is intentional. So not all communication is necessarily intentional. For example, the warning colors of, say, a poison dart frog are a form of communication that they provide information to receivers that the receivers then react behaviorally to, but it's not intentional. The frog doesn't choose to have those colors. They're just born with it. But language, on the other hand, has to be intentional. It involves a conscious intent to inform others. Language is also highly combinatorial. So human language has a feature called duality of patterning, where we combine meaningless phonemes into words, and then which have a meaning, and then we combine those meaningful words into sentences. And that highly combinatorial nature is what allows language to communicate about such a wide range of topics. And specifically, language is also compositional. So when we combine words into sentences, we create a sentence that has a new meaning that's different from the meanings of the words that make it up, but is also related to the meanings of its constituent words. So we kind of build up more complex meaning by combining these units together. Similarly, language is referential. So the things that words refer to are something external to the speaker. We're not simply just communicating by expressing our internal state, but rather we have words that are symbols that refer to concrete objects or concepts or ideas. Language is also mostly, although not entirely, arbitrary. And this is especially true for spoken languages, less so for signed languages. But the value of arbitrariness, so arbitrariness basically means that the symbols that we use in language have no inherent connection to the thing they refer to. Some of them do. There are plenty of iconic words. So like words like buzz or swish are sounds that kind of imitate the thing that they refer to. But the majority of words in human language are not imitative, rather they're arbitrary. And that's what allows us to communicate about such a wide range of objects, including things that don't really make any kind of sound that can be imitated or have any properties that could be indexed with an iconic sound. Language also is context free, and this is another property that's really crucial for its expressivity and its expressiveness and its flexibility. And context free means that the same sentence can be used in a wide variety of contexts and it still has the same meaning. In other words, like a word isn't tied to only being used in a particular context. I can use the word apple to refer to an apple even when it's not there. And I could be talking about throwing an apple. I could be talking about eating an apple. It doesn't matter. It still has the same meaning. And related to that, language has a feature known as displacement, where we can communicate about things that are removed from the present moment in time or space. So all of these features combined are really what gives language its unique ability to communicate about almost any concept in almost any situation. And that's what makes language special. So if we want to understand the evolution of this behavior, these are the types of features that we want to look for in other species. We want to try to use the comparative approach to understand this. So there are kind of two ways to study language via the comparative approach. So one is to look at species that are very closely related to us, like chimpanzees, for example, And then if we find certain features of language that are also shared by chimpanzees, it's a reasonable assumption that those traits may have existed in our last common ancestor with chimpanzees. And so that helps us kind of nail down the evolutionary timeline for when these aspects of language may have originated. On the other hand, we can also look at species that are very distantly related to humans, but have certain features in common with us in their communication systems. And if we find certain features of language in these species, then that can tell us something about the selection pressures that may have caused those features to evolve in the first place. Because, for example, if we find a certain feature of language in birds, for example, like birds, like humans, have their vocal learners. Well, at least songbirds are vocal learners. They learn their songs in a way that parallels the way that humans learn language to some extent. And it's because they're so evolutionarily distant from us, and all of the intervening species don't necessarily have this trait, that suggests that it evolved independently in our two lineages. And so there may have been some common selection pressures that caused this trait to evolve multiple times. So obviously, when I'm talking about elephants, elephants are pretty distantly related to humans. They're mammals, of course, and they're placental mammals, but they're about as different from us evolutionarily as it's possible for a placental mammal to be. We're separated by something like 90 to 100 million years of evolution. So any similarities between humans and elephants in our communication systems that aren't shared by the majority of mammals likely evolved via convergent evolution independently. So elephants are not particularly useful for telling us about the timeline of language evolution in humans, but they may be able to tell us something about the selection pressures that caused language to evolve. And elephants are an interesting group of organisms in which to study this kind of behavior because, like us, they're highly intelligent, they have very large brains, and they're very socially complex. So in African savanna elephants specifically, which is the species that I've done most of my work with, female African savanna elephants live in a highly structured, hierarchically nested society. So the closest unit of social affiliation is a mother and her dependent offspring, but then multiple related mothers and their offspring form a very tightly knit unit called a family group. I'll sometimes refer to it as a core group in this talk because in the population that I study, poaching has really disrupted it. So some of these so-called family groups are not actually all related to each other, but normally under undisturbed conditions, the family group would be primarily composed of highly related individuals. Multiple related family groups form a more loosely knit bond group, and then multiple unrelated bond groups form an even more loosely knit clan that often associates seasonally. So this is kind of the structure. And so elephants have a really large number of social relationships, and they have different social relationships with different individuals in their social network. So being able to communicate in a really complex way might be especially important for them, given the complexity of their social interactions. Now, I just want to give you a general overview sense of what the elephant vocal repertoire sounds like. So the most common call that elephants make by far is not the classic trumpet that people associate with elephants. It's actually a call or a category of calls called rumbles. These are very low frequency calls. They're partially below the range of human hearing. So we can hear the higher harmonics of this call, but we can't hear most of the energy in the call. So keep in mind when I play it for you, you're actually only hearing the higher harmonics of this call. And calling rumbles a single call type is a little bit silly. It's almost like calling speech a single human call type because it encompasses a ton of variation, and they produce rumbles in almost every behavioral context. And these calls comprise anywhere from like 60 to more than 90% of the calls that wild elephants make. So this is what a typical rumble sounds like. And then I'm going to play some of the other calls that they make. So they make a lot of different types of roars. This is a tonal roar. This is a chaotic roar. And this is a mixed roar, which starts tonal and then becomes chaotic. I'm not sure why the mixed roar didn't play, but the next call is the one that played very shortly. That was a bark. And then the one after that is a cry, which is also a very short call made by calves, but it's more tonal. So that's the bark. And then that's the cry, which I don't know why it's not playing. That's bizarre. But let's see if I can get it. Yeah, it's not working. Okay, so this is the trumpet, the classic call that people associate with elephants. You know, I swear that these. Okay, so that's a trumpet. So now I'll play the one that we missed. This is the cry. Still not playing, huh? Okay. So, and then elephants will also sometimes combine calls together. So typically this is going to be some type of roar plus a rumble, although not always. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later, so I won't play those right now. But then in addition to all these calls, and all these calls are shared by all three elephant species, which are the African savanna elephant, the African forest elephant, which is a different species, and then the Asian elephant. So all three elephants produce all the calls I've talked about so far. But then in addition to that, Asian elephants have some additional call types that are extremely high pitched compared to the other calls. And African elephants never produce these under natural conditions. So this is a squeak. And then this is a squeal. So these are, completely unheard of in African elephants, but they're quite common in Asian elephants. Okay. There we go. All right. So, so that's sort of an overview of the elephant vocal repertoire. And now I'm just going to talk about a few of the aspects of elephant vocal communication that explain why I think they're such a good model for understanding language evolution. So, like humans, but unlike the majority of mammals, elephants are vocal production learners, which means that they can learn to modify their vocalizations based on auditory experience. This is a relatively rare ability in mammals, and it's absolutely fundamental for language. We couldn't have spoken language without vocal production learning. So the evidence that elephants are vocal production learners comes primarily from two studies in captivity. So in African savanna elephants in 2005, it was discovered that two individual African savanna elephants in captivity were imitating sounds that are not typical of their species. So one elephant imitated the sounds of a truck. So in this diagram on the left, so in this figure on the left, so the top panel shows the minimum fundamental frequency of a bunch of different sounds. These, I want you to focus on these green triangles over here. These are calls made by an elephant named Malika. And these blue open triangles here are the sounds made by trucks that would pass by her enclosure. And you can see that her calls, in terms of the minimum fundamental frequency, they cluster very closely with these truck sounds. Now, these blue squares and other shapes down here, these are typical African savanna elephant calls. So you can see her truck imitations separated very nicely from the typical calls of her species, but they clustered closely with the sounds of the truck. And the same thing is true when we look at principal component 2 of the data. So again, her truck-like call, this green triangle over here, clusters closely with the truck sound and is very different from her species' typical sounds. Then there was another elephant named Calamero. He was a male African savanna elephant, and he was housed in a zoo with Asian elephants and no other members of his species. So you know how I mentioned that Asian elephants make these squeak calls, which are sometimes called chirps. African savanna elephants never make those in the wild, but Calamero started producing calls that sounded very like the Asian elephant squeaks that he heard around him. So this pink circle down here is his chirp-like imitation, and these red circles are the chirps made by the female Asian elephants that he was housed with. And again, his calls were much more like the Asian elephant chirps or squeaks than they were like species typical calls. So that suggests that African savanna elephants are at least capable of imitating heterospecific sounds. And in 2012, it was shown that a single male Asian elephant was able to imitate human speech. So this elephant was named Koshik. He was housed in a zoo in South Korea by himself. So the only social interaction he had was with human keepers, and they taught him to produce 5 or 6 words in Korean. And when these recordings of him imitating these sounds were played to native Korean speakers who had never seen this elephant before, they were able to reliably recognize the vowels in the words that he imitated. He didn't get the consonants quite right, but the vowels were highly recognizable to native Korean speakers. So again, this shows that Asian elephants as well are capable of vocal production learning. What we don't know is how elephants use this ability in the wild, and that's what I'm going to get into later when I talk about some of my own work. Another aspect of elephant communication that is highly relevant to language is intentionality. So a recent study found that when elephants greet one another, they typically do so with a multimodal display. So it often involves a vocalization as well as some form of gesture. And this gesture can involve touching the receiver, or it can be just a visual gesture like flapping their ears or something like that. And so this study published last year found that when elephants are greeting one another, they pay attention to what the receiver can see when they're producing these multimodal displays. So when the receiver is facing away from them, they're much more likely to include a vocal component or a tactile component to the display. And when the receiver can see them, then they're much more likely to produce a visual component alone, which is what you would expect if the elephants understand that the receiver needs to see them in order to be able to receive a visual display, and they're intending to inform the specific receiver. So in this chart here, I apologize for the really small text, but basically the 3 columns on the left represent situations in which the receiver can see the caller or the signaler. And over here, this, you can barely even see it, but this dark blue bar represents the situations in which the elephant made an audible call. And basically 0 is about as often as you would expect them to. So negative is less often than you would expect them to, and positive is more often than you would expect them to. So when the receiver could see the elephant in these bars on the left, they were slightly less often than you would expect, produced tactile displays, and audible and silent visual displays were about at what you'd expect. But when the receiver couldn't see the sender, they were much more likely than you would expect to produce a tactile display where they touched the individual to get their attention, and slightly more likely than you would expect to make an audible display, and less likely than you would expect to make a silent visual display. So this suggests that elephants are paying attention to the attentional state of the receiver, which suggests some level of intentionality in their calls. And this is what one of these greeting rumbles sounds like. I don't know if you could hear that or not. That was really quiet. But now, another feature of elephant communication that also may have some relevance to understanding the evolution of language is, as I mentioned earlier, they often combine rumbles and roars together into these calls that we call combination calls. And this is relevant to understanding the evolution of language because combinatoriality is so important for human language. And in general, we would expect that any sort of system that has the flexibility and breadth of expression that we associate with language would also require some degree of combinatoriality in order to generate that much variation. So what's interesting about elephant call combinations is they can produce the calls in a wide variety of orders. Like they could have, rumble, roar, roar, rumble, rumble, roar, rumble, roar, rumble, roar, rumble, roar, and even sometimes chain them together in longer sequences like rumble, roar, rumble, something like that. And we see all of these combinations very rarely. So we know that they're physically capable of producing them. But what's interesting is that the vast majority of call combinations they make are one of these 3 types. So there seems to be some kind of rule or restriction on how they tend to combine these calls. The most common of these, so these 3 types are roar, rumble, rumble, roar, rumble, and then rumble, roar. And These are the three most common combinations, but of these three, the most common one depends on the species and the population. So this is sort of what these three sound like. So this is a roar rumble. You can see it starts with this higher pitched call, and then it goes into the low frequency rumble. This is a rumble roar rumble. It starts out low frequency, then goes to high frequency, and then goes back to low. And then this is a rumble roar. Okay, so as I mentioned, the frequency of the different combinations varies by species and population. So this is a figure from a paper published in 2019, looking at the frequency of different call combinations across the three elephant species. So in this figure here, we're just looking at the two African species, African savanna elephants and African forest elephants. On the left, we have African savanna elephants, two different populations. And then on the right, we have two different populations of African forest elephants. So the most obvious difference here, right, is that in the African savanna elephants, the vast majority of the call combinations are roar rumble. Whereas in the African forest elephants, there's a much more even distribution of these three common call types. And then we also see some other combinations rarely as well. But even within each species, there are differences between the populations. So in African savanna elephants on the left, the Embacelli population had far more rumble roar rumbles than the Etosha population did. And in the two populations of African forest elephants on the right, in the CEB1 population, rumble roars were actually the most common call type, whereas in the Jobo population, roar rumbles were the most common call type. And not only do the frequency of the different orderings vary by population and species, but they also vary to some degree by behavioral context, which suggests that the ordering of these components may have something to do with the call's function. So over here in this plot on the right, EM stands for Elephas maximus, that's the Asian elephant. LA stands for Loxodonta africana, that's the African savanna elephant. And in each bar represents the relative proportions of, or the counts of different orderings of combination calls in different behavioral contexts. So if you look at the separation context here, this one is particularly interesting. African savanna elephants were particularly likely to make rumble roar rumbles in the context of separation, significantly more than you would expect. And that suggests that perhaps the order of these components has something to do with meaning. Now, there is a caveat to this. Unlike humans, where combinatoriality is absolutely essential to all of our communication, in elephants, the majority of the calls that they make are standalone rumbles. And combination calls are actually only a much smaller percentage of their total vocal repertoire, and they're also disproportionately made by young individuals. So this may be more of an emotional type of call, where an individual perhaps starts to rumble and then ends up roaring in frustration, or roars in frustration and then it turns into a rumble. But it may not be the same kind of intentional communication that we see with standalone rumbles. One thing that is interesting, though, about the context of these combination calls relative to their standalone components is that the combination call, so the combination calls are made up of roars and rumbles, right? And rumbles, as I mentioned earlier, occur in basically every behavioral context. But one study looked at the context of standalone rumbles, standalone roars or broadband calls, and standalone and then combinations in African forest elephants across 5 different behavioral contexts. And they found that single rumbles occurred in pretty much every context, although they varied in the proportion of calls that they comprised in each context. But the single broadband calls, that is roars, only occurred in 2 of the 5 contexts, specifically competition and nursing. And these are both contexts that are associated with a lot of emotional arousal. So in the competition context, there's some kind of agonistic interaction between individuals. In the nursing context, this is typically when calves are trying to nurse and the mom won't let them. So then they roar in protest. So the roars are associated with these highly emotional contexts. But what was interesting is that the combinations of roars and rumbles occurred in the same number of contexts as the standalone rumbles, but in differing proportions. And so this may suggest, this is just one possible interpretation, that if these calls really do have discrete referential meanings, they might be compositional in the sense that when you combine a roar and a rumble together, they have a context that is different from the context of the standalone components, but still related to it. And compositionality in language is defined as combining two meaningful units together to create something with a new meaning that nonetheless retains some connection to the meanings of its components. This is pretty speculative at this point for elephants because we don't really know if these calls have discrete meanings at all or if they're just expressions of emotional arousal. But it is something that definitely merits further investigation, I think. Now, one thing we do know about referential discrete meanings in elephant calls comes from a study of rumbles that elephants make in an alarm context. So basically, when responding to a threat. And a study by Soltis et al. In 2014 found that elephants produce distinct rumbles in response to disturbed bees versus Samburu, the voices of Samburu warriors, which is the local tribe in the area where this population of elephants was studied. And specifically, in response to bees, they produced rumbles that had an elevated first formant, but not an elevated second formant. And in response to humans, they produced rumbles that had elevated first and second formants. And when the researchers played back these calls to the elephants, they found that the bee rumble elicited fleeing behavior. So they left the area, and they also increased their head shaking behavior relative to before the playback. And head shaking is a behavior that elephants engage in to dislodge bees from stinging them on their sensitive ears. In response to the human rumbles, the elephants also fled, but there was no increase in head shaking. So this suggests, at least from this one study, that elephants may have rumbles that are functionally referential, that they're specific to particular types of threats, rather than simply indicating the elephant's level of emotional arousal. Now, these alarm calls are similar in many ways to the types of alarm calls that we see in a lot of other species. So many birds and mammals produce alarm calls that are specific to particular threats. But it's been questioned whether this is really all that relevant to understanding the evolution of human language, because in most cases, these alarm calls seem to be largely innate rather than learned. Animals have to learn to some extent the context in which to make these calls, but the structure of the call itself seems to be primarily innate. And so in elephants, we know that they're capable of vocal learning in captivity, but we have no idea if they're using learning to learn their alarm rumbles in the wild or not. So we don't really know if these are learned referential signals or if they're innate, like the alarm calls of non-human primates, for example. So one way that we can study learned referential communication is by looking at a context in which there's only one, the only way that an animal could have a particular referential call is if it's learned. And a great example of that is names. So unlike alarm calls, personal names by their very nature have to be learned, because there's no way for an individual to be born knowing the names of all of its future social affiliates. And there are some examples of this in non-human animals. So the best studied example is in bottlenose dolphins, who produce signature whistles. So signature whistles are a unique stereotyped whistle. Each individual has their own signature, which they develop on their own when they're young. And they use this to identify themselves to others most of the time. So most of the time that an individual produces a signature whistle, they're making their own whistle to let other individuals know who they are. But occasionally, dolphins will call one another by name by imitating the signature whistle of the individual that they're trying to address. And there are some species of parrots that seem to do something similar in the sense that they imitate one another's unique contact calls to address communication to the individual that they're imitating. Now, one potential difference between this type of naming system and the way that names work in humans is that you can make an argument that when a dolphin imitates somebody else's signature whistle, this may not be an arbitrary signal. Rather, they may be imitating the sound that is most commonly associated with the individual that they're trying to address, similar to the way in which we might refer to a bee by just making a buzzing sound. Like we theoretically could just say bzz, 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 instead of saying the word bee, and people would probably understand what we were talking about. But that's not really an arbitrary signal because we're imitating the sound that is produced by the thing we're referring to. So when dolphins make their own signature whistle, that's indisputably an arbitrary signal. But when they're imitating someone else's whistle to name them, it's debatable whether that is actually arbitrary or whether they're just imitating the individual that they're trying to refer to in sort of an iconic way. And as I mentioned before, arbitrariness is important for human language because it expands the breadth of reference that we can talk about. So if we want to understand the evolution of arbitrary labeling or arbitrary referential communication, finding an example of arbitrary vocal labels or names in a non-human species could be a really valuable point of comparison to study that. And so that brings me to elephants. So when I set out to study the possibility that elephants might have name-like calls, I had several hypotheses that I was trying to test. So number one, the first hypothesis is that elephant calls contain some kind of vocal label that is specific to individual receivers. So we should expect to see some kind of acoustic signature of receiver identity in the calls. Number two, the elephants can perceive and respond to this information. So we would expect that if we play these calls back to the elephants, they should react as if they recognize that the call was addressed to them versus somebody else. And then I also hypothesized that similar to humans and dolphins, different callers will use the same label to address the same receiver. The alternative, of course, is that every caller comes up with their own nickname for a given receiver, and everybody uses kind of different names to address the same individual. And then finally, I hypothesized that elephants use arbitrary labels rather than imitations of the receiver's calls. And this is partly because, unlike dolphins, there's no evidence of unique stereotyped calls like signature whistles that in elephants. Elephants certainly have unique voices, so it's theoretically possible that callers could address a receiver by imitating the voice patterns of the receiver. But at least so far, we're not aware of any stereotyped signature call in elephants. So it seems likely that if elephants have names, at least I hypothesize that if elephants have names, they would be arbitrary. And so these are the four things that I set out to test. I did this work in Samburu and Buffalo Springs National Reserves in northern Kenya. This population has been studied by my former postdoc advisor, George Whittemire, and the organization Save the Elephants since the 1990s. And all of the individuals are individually identified, which makes things a lot easier for us. So I spent about 14 months in Kenya recording rumbles. I focused on rumbles because they're the most common calls elephants make. They're the most structurally and contextually variable and complex. And I focused on recording calls where we were able to identify who the caller was and also who the receiver was. And so I did this based on the behavioral context. So, for example, we would follow an elephant family around all day. And if sometimes there'd be a situation in which one individual would be lagging behind the group and then everybody else would kind of move off. And then one individual in the main body of the group would stop and wait for the lagging individual and make long distance contact calls to her. And so in that situation, we could be reasonably certain that the individual she was addressing is the one individual who is lagging. Or similarly, when two elephants are interacting at close distance, and it's very obvious that it's just a dyadic interaction between the two individuals, we can be reasonably certain that the receiver is the one individual who was not making the call. So we recorded several hundred calls with known callers and known receivers. And then I also used a data set collected by my collaborator, Joyce Poole, decades earlier in Amboseli National Park in southern Kenya, where she just by happenstance happened to have some calls where she had recorded who the receiver was, even though that wasn't the original intent of her study. So all told, we had about 450 calls roughly from with known callers and known receivers. And in this data set, I focused on 3 specific contexts because these were the contexts in which it was easiest to identify who the intended receiver was. So these were contact calls, which are long distance calls made when an individual is trying to communicate with the receiver at a distance when they're out of sight of each other. Greeting rumbles, which are made when 2 individuals who are bonded approach one another to within touching distance. And then coo rumbles, which are calls made by mothers and other female caregivers to calves in a caregiving context, typically either when nursing the calf or when comforting the calf after the calf expressed distress for some reason. So these are the contexts in which it was often possible to identify who the intended receiver was, and there was just one specific receiver. So to measure the acoustic properties of these calls, we extracted a series of acoustic features that are somewhat esoteric, but we designed this this feature set in a way that to try and capture as much of the variation in the calls as we could. So basically, we converted the spectrogram to a Mel spectrogram, which sort of warps it to the logarithmic hearing sensitivities of humans, and most mammals have similar logarithmic hearing curves. And then we extracted a series of measurements that basically described the distribution of energy across time and frequency in the calls. And then we use these features to train a random forest model to predict who a call was addressed to just from the acoustic patterns in that call. So this random forest is basically a classifier that combines many decision trees, and we use these acoustic features to train the model to learn to associate acoustic patterns with receiver identity, and then we tested it on a subset of the data that was not used to train the model. We did this iteratively for 7 folds of the data. So basically, the model was trained and tested on the full data set, just not all at the same time. And what we found is that the model correctly predicted the receiver for 27.5% of the calls. Now, this might not seem like a ton, but you have to remember that we wouldn't expect elephants to use names in every situation anyway. And we had no way of knowing a priori which calls might contain a name and which didn't. So to see if this 27.5% was better than if the model was just randomly guessing, we trained another 10,000 random forests on the same data set, but with the acoustic features randomly scrambled. So the data set was meaningless, basically. And we found that the original model performed significantly better than this distribution of null models with randomly scrambled data. So in this figure, the black histogram represents the classification accuracies of the 10,000 null models, and then this red bar represents the 27.5% correct that we got with the original model. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the calls contain names, though, because there could be other features in the calls that the model was using to predict receiver identity. All of this, the random forest showed us, is that the calls contain some kind of acoustic information that allowed the model to correctly guess, at least some of the time, who the receiver was. So one alternative explanation is that because our data set was highly imbalanced with regard to caller ID and receiver ID, the model might have been picking up on the caller's vocal cues and using that to guess who the receiver was, based on the fact that certain callers called more often to certain receivers. Another possibility is that calls might be specific to the general type of relationship between the caller and the receiver. For example, maybe callers make slightly higher pitched calls when they're calling to somebody who's dominant to them. And if that's the case, then the model might have used that to guess who the receiver was with better than chance accuracy. So to rule out these possibilities, we extracted something from random forests called proximity scores. This is a really nice property of random forests, which is that in addition to providing classifications of the data, they also give you a measure of pairwise similarity between each possible pair of observations in the data set. So the way this works is that across all the trees in the random forest, the number of trees in which two particular calls occurred in the same terminal leaf is the proximity of those two pairs of calls. So the more trees that where the two calls appear together in the same terminal leaf, the higher their proximity score. and the more similar they are in terms of the acoustic features that were most relevant to predicting receiver identity. So when we looked at these proximity scores, we found that pairs of calls with the same caller and the same receiver were significantly more similar on average than pairs of calls with the same caller and different receivers. So that means that it's not just that that calls are specific to individual callers. Rather, even when we hold caller identity constant, calls addressed to the same receiver are more similar than calls addressed to different receivers. In addition to that, we restricted this analysis to pairs of calls where the two receivers had the same type of relationship to the caller. So this also rules out the possibility that the elephants were simply, that the calls simply contained information about the general relationship between the caller and the receiver. Rather, it suggests that the calls really are specific to individual receivers. So this showed that the calls have some information that potentially might be a name, but we didn't know yet if the elephants could actually perceive and respond to it. So to do that, we did a playback experiment where we played back 2 calls each to 17 different subjects. So each elephant received a call that was originally addressed to her and a playback of a call from the same caller that was originally addressed to someone else. So by holding caller identity constant in the 2 playbacks, we ensured that the receiver wasn't simply responding more to one call because she had a stronger relationship with that caller. So for example, if we recorded 2 calls from caller A, one addressed to receiver B, one addressed to receiver C, we would expect that B would respond more strongly to the call that was originally addressed to B, and C would respond more strongly to the call that was originally addressed to C. And to do these playbacks, we needed to use a custom-built loudspeaker because elephant rumbles have an infrasonic component. Part of them is below the range of human hearing, so you can't use like a typical commercially available speaker for this. But we had a custom-built loudspeaker make that could reproduce infrasound. And just to give you a sense of what these playbacks look like, this is a video of a playback we did to a female called Margaret. And this was a call that was originally addressed to Margaret. So let's see how she responds to it. Okay, so as you can see, she called back immediately, lifted up her head. Now let's see what happens when we play back a call from the same caller that was originally addressed to someone else. So as you can see here, Margaret lifted up her head, indicating that she heard the playback, but she didn't call back. And so that is kind of typical of the pattern we observed overall. Elephants, on average, responded more strongly to the calls originally addressed to them than to the calls from the same caller originally addressed to someone else. So in this plot here, this is a Kaplan-Meier survival curve kind of turned on its head. So the x-axis represents the time since the playback, and then the y-axis is the cumulative probability of an approach. So basically, this is measuring the latency to approach the speaker. So the red line represents test trials in which the call that we played back was a call that was originally addressed to the subject, and the blue line represents controls in which we played back a call from the same caller addressed to somebody else. And as you can see, the red line rises faster than the blue line, indicating that elephants tended to approach the speaker more quickly in response to calls originally addressed to them. They also tended to vocalize more quickly in response to calls originally addressed to them. And then finally, they produced more vocalizations on average in response to calls originally addressed to them than to calls from the same caller originally addressed to someone else. So taken together, this suggests that elephants can tell just by hearing a call if it was intended for them or if it was intended for another member of their family. Now, I wanted to know something more about how exactly these labels work. So are elephants imitating the overall voice patterns of the individual that they're trying to address, kind of similar to the way that dolphins and parrots imitate each other's signature calls, or are they using an arbitrary signal that has nothing to do with the receiver's calls? So to assess this, we looked at calls made by the receiver and other calls made by the caller. And we expected that if elephants are imitating the receiver, then a call addressed to a given receiver should be more similar to her than to the calls, should be more similar to the receiver's own calls than to the calls of other individuals. But that's not what we found. So when we we basically divided calls up into convergent and divergent calls. So convergent calls were more similar to the receiver's calls than typical for that caller, and divergent calls were less similar to the receiver's calls than typical for that caller. And we found that the random forest performed much better than the null models for both convergent and divergent calls. And in fact, actually had slightly higher classification accuracy for the divergent calls. So that suggests that elephants are not relying on imitation of the receiver's calls to address her. But keep in mind that we had a very small sample of calls from each receiver. So it's possible that we simply didn't record enough calls from the receiver to accurately capture what her voice sounded like, or potentially maybe elephants do have signature calls, but they just don't make them as often as dolphins do. And so this maybe we didn't capture that in our data set. We would need to more exhaustively sample the repertoire of each individual to be certain about this. But our data at least tentatively suggests that elephants are not imitating one another's calls in order to address each other. Now, what about the hypothesis that elephants that different callers are using the same label to address the same receiver? So to assess that, we again use the proximity scores, and we found that calls from different callers to the same receiver were significantly more similar on average than calls from different callers to different receivers. So this suggests that elephants are using similar labels to address the same receiver. With that said, when we tried to train a random forest model to predict, basically we tried to train it to predict receiver identity independent of caller identity by training it on different sets of caller receiver pairs than we tested it on. And when we did this, we found that it was not able to predict the receiver better than the null model in the test set of caller receiver pairs that was different caller receiver pairs from the training data. Now, this might be because we simply didn't have enough data from different callers addressing the same receiver for the model to learn this. And I suspect that that is the case because of what we found with the proximity scores. We found evidence in the proximity scores that different callers are using similar labels for the same receiver, but we can't entirely rule out the possibility that different callers are using distinct, albeit somewhat similar labels for the same receiver. So to put this in very loosely in human terms, that might be kind of analogous to different people using distinct nicknames to refer to the same individual. So for example, a woman named Elizabeth might be called Ellie by her friends, Elizabeth by her mother, Liz by her partner. Those sounds all have something in common, but they're not exactly the same name. So this is a little bit of an unknown quantity at present. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about in this study is that we wanted to understand, when do elephants use vocal labels? So we looked at the context. So remember, we used 3 contexts of rumbles: contact rumbles, greeting rumbles, and coup rumbles. And we looked at how the random forest performed at predicting the receiver for each of these 3 contexts. And what was interesting is, well, as you might expect, we found that it was pretty good at predicting the receiver for contact calls. And you might expect that because contact calls are made when the caller and the receiver are out of sight of each other. And so it might be particularly beneficial for the caller to address communication to a specific individual by name, because otherwise, how does the receiver know that she's talking to her? And greeting rumbles, which are produced at very close distance, where it's very obvious who the receiver is, the model was pretty bad at predicting the receiver for that. So again, that makes sense, because why would elephants need to use a name in most greeting calls when the receiver can see them and they're obviously interacting with each other? What was surprising is that the model was very good at predicting the receiver for coup rumbles. And this is not because mothers only, like, coup rumbles were only ever from a mother to her calf. Sometimes we had coup rumbles from non-mothers to the same calf. So there were multiple different callers in many cases addressing the same calf. So I don't think it was just an artifact of the fact that the receiver is more predictable for coup rumbles, although we can't entirely rule that out. But it's a little puzzling. Why would elephants be particularly likely to use vocal labels in coup rumbles, which are also produced at close distance, just like greeting rumbles? And this is just a hypothesis at present, but I think that one possibility might be that this could be how calves learn their names. So if the mother gives the name to the calf, she might make coup rumbles so that the calf basically imprints on this name and learns to respond to it. And then other individuals also learn it as well. And one sort of intriguing observation that I've seen myself, and a lot of my colleagues who have been studying elephants for years have seen as well, is that when an elephant gives birth, she makes coo rumbles over and over and over again to the calf repeatedly. And so it's at least possible that this is sort of how elephants get their names. Definitely something I'd like to investigate in the future, if I can ever get funding to do so. So to sum up, we found evidence that elephant rumbles, or at least some rumbles, contain receiver-specific information, that receivers can respond to these vocal labels. These labels are likely not imitations of the receiver's calls, although we don't know for sure. And it seems that different callers use similar but perhaps not identical labels to identify the same receiver. And then finally, we have preliminary evidence, at least, that elephants may be more likely to use vocal labels in contact rumbles and coo rumbles than in greeting rumbles. Okay, so now the last thing I wanted to talk about is another study that I did during the same postdoc, looking at another possible function and or non-adaptive consequence of vocal learning in wild African elephants. So many animals exhibit geographic variation in their vocalizations, and in animals that have that learn their vocalizations, this is particularly likely to occur. And in animals with learning, what we often see is the development of dialects, where there's sort of discrete differences between different geographic regions in the songs or calls produced by animals. So a classic example is white-crowned sparrows. This figure here from an animal behavior textbook shows these 3 different populations in the Bay Area of California, and the songs that they sing are distinct in each population, and every population kind of sings their own unique dialect. Now, geographic variation in vocalizations doesn't necessarily imply vocal learning, but it is often a consequence of vocal learning. Another type of variation that we see is at a smaller scale, and that's between sympatric social groups. So in some animals, different social groups that live in the same area have distinct vocal patterns. So for example, in orcas and sperm whales and pilot whales as well, they have dialects, but the dialects are not geographic. Rather, they're sympatric. Different social groups that don't associate with each other as much develop their own unique signature or dialect. And they use this to identify each other. And in whales, this seems to be basically the dialects are different repertoires of discrete signals. So one group might have a particular repertoire of signals, and then another group might have their own repertoire which partially overlaps but doesn't fully overlap. And that's why they're distinct, discrete dialects. But more commonly, what we see is that animals have sort of differences in the fine acoustic structure of their vocalizations. So they all make the same basic call types, but the specific structure of those call types is subtly different between different groups. So we see this in a lot of animals, especially animals with vocal learning ability, although animals don't have to have particularly advanced vocal learning ability to develop vocal group signatures. So for example, in greater spear-nosed bats, these bats live in caves like many bats do, and individuals within the cave form little clusters, and they sound more similar to other bats in their own cluster than to other clusters in the same cave. And then among different caves, they're also distinct. So they kind of have 2 different levels of group signatures, one at the level of the social group and then one at the level of the whole cave. In gelada monkeys, they also kind of have this nested structure of social organization, where they have small groups, and then the groups form larger bands. And what's interesting about geladas is that they have group signatures, but only at this larger unit of social affiliation. It basically seems to be a way for individuals in the same band to keep in touch with each other by listening for calls that belong to their own group signature. Now, just to remind you of the social structure of female African savanna elephants, they also have a nested social structure where you have tightly knit family or core groups coming together to form a more loosely knit bond group, and then bond groups coming together to form an even more loosely knit clan. And it's been shown that elephants can recognize individuals, or at least they can recognize the difference between close social affiliates, distant social affiliates, and non-affiliates based on their vocalizations. So one possibility is that elephants are recognizing all of these different individuals. But if they do that, they would have to recognize at least 100 adult individuals to be able to reliably distinguish between close social affiliates, distant social affiliates, and non-affiliates. And the other possibility is that elephants has some kind of group signature that facilitates the task of recognizing so many individuals by voice, particularly at the level of more distant social affiliates that they don't interact with very often. So, for example, perhaps they have vocal group signatures at the level of the bond group or the clan, and this is what allows them to identify their more distant social affiliates. So I hypothesized that elephants would have differences in the structure of their rumbles between populations, between different bond groups in the same population, and between different core or family groups within the same bond group. And finally, I hypothesized that vocal differences among social groups, if they exist, are better explained by social affiliation than by genetics. So again, I went back to the same populations that I studied in the first study I talked about, Samburu and Amboseli. So again, I collaborated with Joyce Poole to use her pre-existing data set on Amboseli and then combine it with the recordings that I collected in Samburu many years later. And because these calls were collected across multiple decades, different recording equipment was used to collect the calls in Amboseli and in Samburu. And for this study, we focused just on adult females because that kind of removed some of the variation associated with age and sex. And also that's the age and sex class that we had the most calls for. So I extracted two sets of acoustic features for this analysis. The first was the same set of sort of esoteric, difficult to interpret features that we used in the name-like call study. And that is because those features capture more of the variation in the acoustic structure of the calls. But then because we had recorded calls from two different populations using different recording equipment in each population, we needed to be sure that these difficult to interpret features weren't capturing some aspect of the recording gear. So to do that, we also measured the frequency contour of the second harmonic, which has been shown to be highly robust to differences in recording equipment. So that was, we could just be sure that any differences between the populations weren't an artifact of the recording gear that we used. So again, we used random forest to predict the population, bond group, and core group of the rumbles. And this time, because we had different numbers of calls from each group, we used a null model that's called the majority classifier. So the majority classifier basically always predicts the most common class. So like, for example, if you have two populations and you have 60% of the calls from one population and 40% of the calls from the other population, if you guess randomly, you would guess 50% for each. But if you use the majority classifier that always picks the most common class, it would guess 60% for it would always guess the most common class, right? So the class that had 60% of the calls would always be the predicted class. And so it would actually outperform the total random guessing. So it's basically a more conservative null model than using total random guessing. And then we ran 10,000 iterations where we ran the random forest trained on the actual data and compared its classification accuracy to the majority classifier, and then saw whether it outperformed the majority classifier on average. So yeah, again, this is sort of the structure of the random forest that it combines multiple decision trees and then averages them to get the final result. So these p-values, unfortunately, I should have made them hidden. Just ignore those p-values on the right for now. We'll get to them in a second. But basically, we found evidence that the Samburu and Amboseli rumbles are distinct. So when we ran a random forest model on the full set of acoustic features, which is the panel on the top left here. The majority class, so this x-axis, to explain how this works, basically, the x-axis is the accuracy of the model minus the accuracy of its corresponding majority classifier. So positive values on the x-axis mean that the model outperformed the majority classifier, and negative values mean that it performed worse than the majority classifier. 0 means 0, where the red line is, represents models, that performed identically to the majority classifier. So this gray histogram is the performance of our models. And as you can see, with the full, with the acoustic features that encompass the full spectrum of the call, all of the models outperformed the majority classifier. And the median accuracy of these models was 79% correct. So on average, was predicting 79% of the calls correctly. And even when we used the reduced feature set that was more robust to recording equipment influence, we still found that the models on average significantly outperformed the majority classifier. Now, when we look at the specific acoustic features that differed between these populations, we see that the Samburu population had a higher fundamental frequency. We measure the second harmonic, but effectively that's equivalent to measuring the fundamental frequency, because it's just 2 times the fundamental. So Samburu population had a higher frequency, and it also had a greater standard deviation of the frequency contour. So basically that means it had a more variable frequency. And then the third acoustic feature that differed significantly between the populations was the value of the second harmonic at 75% of the call's duration. So again, that also indicates that the Samburu rumbles had higher frequencies than the Amboseli rumbles, and you can see that in this diagram on the right. These are spectrograms of calls from the 2 different populations. The one on the left is from Amboseli, the one on the right is from Samburu. These are both rumbles produced by a 19-year-old female elephant in the same behavioral context. And as you can see, the Samburu spectrogram here has a higher frequency. The frequency contour is more variable, and the frequency at 75% of the call duration is also higher. So this is sort of the overall difference between the 2 populations. Now, when we tried to predict bond group and core group from the acoustic features, the random forest performed pretty badly. So for the bond group model, the median accuracy of the bond group models was 10%. This was actually significantly better than the majority classifier, but it's still pretty bad performance. The core group model had slightly better accuracy, but its majority classifier was also better just because of the data structure and how many calls were in each class. So the core group model actually failed to outperform the majority classifier at all. So here we have, little to no evidence that calls can be reliably assigned to social group based on the acoustic features we measured. But when we looked at the proximity scores, we did find subtle evidence for differences between the groups. So when we extracted proximity scores from the model trained to predict bond group, we found that calls from the same core group were significantly more similar, albeit with a very small effect size, than calls from totally different bond groups. And when we extracted proximity scores from the core group model, we found that calls from the same core group were significantly more similar than calls from different core groups within the same bond group, as well as more similar than calls from different bond groups. So this suggests that there is at least some subtle difference between social groups, but it's not very pronounced. Now, for the final hypothesis about, I expected that if there were any differences between social groups, they would be learned rather than genetic. And we were actually able to test this in this population because of an unfortunate history of poaching in the Samburu population. So in Samburu, a lot of the elephants have been, especially in like 2009, 2010, a lot of elephants were killed by poaching, and this caused a reshuffling of the social structure, where some elephants whose entire families were wiped out basically joined another family and were adopted by them. And so now we have these families that have some individuals who are unrelated to their core group or family group members. And so we found that group membership was a significant predictor of call similarity using these proximity scores for the proximity scores extracted from the core group model. And it was marginally non-significant for the proximity scores extracted from the bond group model. But genetic distance had no effect on call similarity. So this suggests that group membership is a better predictor of call similarity than genetic relatedness, which supports the hypothesis that elephants are learning these subtle group differences. So to sum up this study, we found that Samburu rumbles have higher and more variable frequencies than Amboseli rumbles. And we found very slight vocal differences among sympatric social groups in the Samburu population. I forgot to mention, we didn't include Amboseli in the study of differences among sympatric social groups because almost all the calls that I had from my collaborator in that population were recorded from a single family group. So this was just in the Samburu population. We found evidence for slight vocal differences among sympatric social groups. And the population differences between Samburu and Amboseli could be learned, they could be genetic, or they could be environmental, we don't know. But we found some evidence that the differences among social groups in Samburu are likely learned, in that social group membership was a better predictor of call similarity than genetic distance. So some of the things I would like to focus on in the future, which I think might be really promising areas for using elephants as a model to study language evolution, is number one, how is information encoded in rumbles? And I think that there is a recent discovery that the formants in elephant calls, which are basically an acoustic feature that many mammals have formants in their calls, and in humans, formants are basically what distinguishes between different vowels in human speech. Elephants have formants, and people have measured them a lot, but most studies that have measured elephant formants have treated the formants as if they were invariant across the call. And there was a recent discovery that actually the formants do seem to change over the course of the call, just like the formants in human speech. And I think this might be a really interesting avenue for future research to investigate how information is encoded in elephant rumbles. Two, I'd really like to understand how elephants learn calls in the wild. Like, what's the ontogeny of call development, and what's the role of learning? And then finally, I think we really need to understand more about how elephants are using names. Do they just use them to address one another, or do they ever talk about one another in the third person, as like humans do, essentially, referring to somebody in their absence? That would be really fascinating if they did, and definitely would if they did, it would provide another point of comparison for understanding the evolution of displacement in human language and context-free grammars. And also, I think it's possible that if elephants can label each other, they might label other things too. So those alarm calls that elephants make to humans and bees, it's possible that those are learned signals. And if they are, that would be another example of learned vocal labels in elephants. And another possible context in which labeling might be useful is in let's go rumbles. So when elephants want to get their group moving and they want to move off in a particular direction, they'll face in the direction they want to go with their back to the rest of the group, like you see in this picture on the right, and they'll make a specific type of rumble called the let's go rumble. And this usually precipitates a back and forth exchange of rumbles among multiple individuals in the group before the group all moves off together. And so it's possible that these calls are simply just indicating, I want to start moving, and the direction that their body points indicates the direction they want to move. But it's also possible they're more sophisticated. They could even be labeling the specific place they want to go to. And I think by combining vocal recordings with GPS tracking data for collared elephants, we might be able to figure out if this is the case. And if so, it would really, be one of the very few examples of animals using learned vocal labels to communicate about multiple different things in the wild. So yeah, with that, I guess we can open it up to questions.
All right, thank you, Mickey, for a really fascinating talk.
Thanks.
So at this point, it's time for discussion, and just two quick announcements before we get there. First off, we sent a survey out to the email list, please respond to that. We'd like your feedback on the future of Fine in anticipation of a discussion we're going to have in a couple of weeks. And second of all, for next week's talk, I forgot to mention, I believe Europe is changing the clocks at that point. The time will remain 11 a.m. New York time. So whatever time that is in Europe at this point, please make sure you attend then. So again, for questions, if you're a student or postdoc, please add an S or a P and we'll prioritize you. All right, so the first one I see in the queue here is from Clara. Please go ahead.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks for the talk, Michael. The playback experiments are fascinating. I'm Clara Jones, Clara B. Jones, retired, specialized in social evolution. I want to give a disclaimer first. As impeccable as your work seems to be, I'm very skeptical of descriptive studies. And I look for math modeling that starts off testing assumptions. I wanted to ask you first, do elephants carry the FOXP2 gene as humans and songbirds do, other vocal learners?
Mhm. So I'm far from a geneticist by any stretch of the imagination. My understanding is that the FOXP2 gene is actually like pretty highly conserved, and what's unique about it is that humans have a particular mutation in that gene, but the gene itself, I believe, exists in all vertebrates, and may even have homologs in invertebrates as well. But I don't know, to what extent I don't know how similar the sequence of the FOXP2 gene is between humans.
Okay, my understanding is that it's specific to vocal learners, and that songbirds also carry it, and a few other vocal learners. I wanted to ask finally whether or not you use an AI research assistant, and if so, which tool do you use, and how helpful do you find it in your work?
So do you mean like my AI research assistant? Do you mean like a large language model that can
Like,
find
yes,
sources
exactly. Claude or O1 Pro or GPT-4 or yeah.
I don't. Maybe I should. I have some friends who use it, and they said that it has been really helpful. I use sometimes I use like the free version of ChatGPT to help with coding, but I haven't really used those types of assistants very much.
Okay, great. Good luck.
Thanks.
Okay, our next question comes from a student, Luisa.
Okay, so hi, nice to meet you.
You too.
I'm so glad to hear your investigation. I'm so fascinating for communication in elephants. So my question is, how did you determine that elephants have a communication system similar to humans' language?
So I think it's not so much a binary question like is a communication system similar to humans or not. It's more a question of how similar is it, right? Like there are many different aspects of the communication systems of every species, and some of those aspects are going to be shared in common and some won't. So we already knew from previous work that was done before me that elephants were capable of vocal learning, at least in captivity. So that's one point of similarity with humans. We already knew that there was evidence for potentially referential calls in alarm calls in elephants from a study done in 2014. We knew that their calls were they had that rumbles have certain acoustic properties in common with human speech in the sense of being highly harmonic vocalizations with formants. This was all done figured out by work that people did before me. So I had no idea going into the study if elephants would have name-like calls or not. I hypothesized that they would, based on the fact that they're known vocal learners, and given their social structure, it seems like it might be particularly valuable for them to have a way of addressing communication to specific individuals, given that they have so many different relationships with different individuals and they're often out of sight of each other. But that was, sort of the impetus to try to do this study. And so, the results of that study kind of provide us with an additional point of similarity between human and elephant communication, in that, most species, we don't have evidence for name-like calls in most species. It seems to be, somewhat rare, at least. Although I suspect it's probably a little bit more common than we currently realize. And so that, is another area in which humans and elephants are similar, but obviously there's still going to be a lot of differences in our communication systems as well.
Okay. Okay. I have another question, and recently I heard that some species of elephants are in danger. So I would like to know that how this study help to conservation these species. For example, in the case of farmed elephants being rehabilitated and released. In other words, how this affect their reintegration in the environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are a few ways in which my work might intersect with conservation. So one, actually, the study, my study showing that there are acoustic differences in the calls of these two populations in Kenya that are about 400 kilometers apart from each other. That has some potential implications for conservation, because managers often translocate elephants between different regions, either to facilitate gene flow or to mitigate human-elephant conflict. And if these acoustic differences between populations have any impact on communication, which we don't know if they do, but it's certainly plausible, that might impede the successful integration of individuals across populations. So, if further research shows that there really are that elephants from different populations have difficulty understanding each other, that would be something we would need to take into account when translocating elephants. In terms of the study on elephant names, I think there's a couple potential points of relevance to conservation. One is actually something that may be a little bit underappreciated. I think I certainly underappreciated it before I did this study and saw how much people were actually interested in it. But I think that these types of behavioral studies have the potential to excite people about wild animals, elephants in this case, and therefore inspire more motivation for conservation. So I think if people appreciate nature, they care about preserving it more. And I think that people really relate to behavioral stories. So this can be valuable for increasing motivation for conservation. And in terms of more practical, direct applications, as you mentioned, when elephants are being rehabilitated for release into the wild, I think it is really important to take into account, are they going to be able to learn normal behavioral repertoires? And that includes vocal repertoires. So vocal learning, we know elephants are capable of it. We don't know how central it is to their communication in the wild. But if they have name-like calls, it's pretty hard to imagine how they could do that without learning them. So it suggests that they are using their vocal learning ability in the wild, and that might cause problems for rehabilitating elephants and releasing them, because then they may not have normal vocal behavior. So I think first we need to figure out exactly to what extent are elephant calls learned, how do they use learning to develop a normal vocal repertoire, and then we need to integrate that into plans for rehabilitating elephants so that they can learn normal behavior and they don't go off in the wild and not know how to interact properly with wild elephants.
Okay, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from another student, that's Sebastian.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for the seminar. It was it was just incredible. I knew of these.
Thanks.
Yes, yeah, I knew of these like dialects and aspects in dolphins and birds, but I never heard of them in elephants. So it was really cool to see. So I have two questions. The first one is related to the question about conservation. And it's whether, like, did you saw in your studies or somewhere if elephants were more likely to reject another elephant based on their dialect or their name or their labels?
We don't know that. I think it's definitely something that should be investigated, whether like having a different dialect or like producing calls from a different population would impede communication or impede social integration. What the only study I know of that has any kind of bearing on that is that there's one experiment where people played back calls from one population of African savanna elephants to another, and the elephants who heard the playbacks responded to calls from their own population, but not to calls from the other population. But with that said, the study had a very small set of exemplars that they played back, so it's possible that the reason for the lack of response had to do with the recordings themselves and not specifically because they came from different populations. It's also possible that the elephants understood the calls, but simply were more likely to respond to calls from individuals that they know, because we know in a lot of species, animals are more likely to respond to communications from individuals that they know and trust rather than from strangers. And it's quite possible that that's the case for elephants as well. So that study isn't enough to tell us whether they can't understand each other across populations, but it suggests that that's at least a possibility. So I think it's really important to do that study so that we know, especially for this situation in which people are translocating elephants across populations, that might be causing more problems for them than we realize.
Thanks. And the second question is, like, when you mentioned that there's a slight difference in how different colors use a label to talk about the receiver. I was thinking a behavior we see in humans, well, two behaviors, that name calling and nicknames. And those two behaviors can be like dependent on how close is one to another. So I wanted to know if you think that could be a plausible explanation to that slight difference, like how close are some individuals, they may differ in how they use a label for someone, and that individual may answer differently to different use of the label depending on how close they are to other individual.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a possibility. I think what we really need to do is figure out exactly how these labels are encoded in the calls and isolate the labels for specific individuals. Then we can answer all these questions for sure about how do elephants use these calls? Do different callers use the same label or different versions of the same label to address the same individual? But I think what you suggested is absolutely one possibility. It's not the only possibility.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so Adriana, do you have time or would you rather I skip you? No? Okay. And then I thought, Juan, you had a question, or did you retract it?
Yeah, I forgot I'm not a postdoc anymore. Sorry.
That's all right. Well, do you have a question? Because please.
Yes, I do. It's
Go ahead.
quite general. Hello, Michael. Thanks a lot for the talk. It's really cool studies that you've been doing. So I have a very general question. And it's about, you started with analogy and homology, which is a good starting point for this kind of comparative questions, right? And I think in the period of time that I've been looking into language evolution, we've found so many abilities in animals that we thought were, uniquely human just 15 years ago. And so,
Mhm.
and as species keep joining into the ones that could serve as a model for the precursor of language, something that I keep seeing is that they tend to be vocal species. And we had this period in primatology where we focus on gesture a lot. And now it
Mhm.
seems like it's back to us being able to conceive of vocal abilities as serving as precursor. And I wanted to ask if you think, in general, if there's something about rich vocalizations lending themselves to these kind of complex functions. So the auditory modality, perhaps, or the medium, the vibrations on the air, or if we are maybe being biased to look at vocal species, because that's how we recognize these abilities more intuitively.
Yeah, I think it could be either one, honestly. I think there definitely is a bias toward vocal communication. One, because, we're more familiar with it, but two, because for practical reasons, like it's just a lot easier to manipulate vocal signals with playbacks than like gestural signals. You have to somehow use video playback or like a robot, or it's just a lot harder to convince an animal that you're actually producing a gesture from another real animal. Whereas like with a playback, you just do it from behind a bush and they just think somebody's behind the bush calling. So it's easier from that perspective. I think, I don't know, it's hard to say, like in the sense of how human language evolved. I think it's certainly plausible that it evolved via gestures that then switched over to vocalizations or not. I don't think we know. One thing that is kind of interesting is that we see in a lot of animals that vocalizations that are not entirely learned seem to have a lot more cognitive sophistication associated with them than people used to realize. So like alarm calls, people said, oh, well, this is not really like a precursor to words because these calls are innate. Well, okay, but what do we mean by innate? Because like vervet monkeys still have to learn to some extent the context in which they produce these alarm calls. And they have to learn like when to produce them. And we see like even in non-human primates that are canonically considered non-vocal learners, we're starting to see evidence of some that vocal learning is actually a spectrum, right? So there's there was a study that came out shortly after mine in common marmosets showing a very similar thing, that they seem to have name-like calls. Well, how do they have that if they're not vocal learners? Or chimpanzees, their alarm calls are presumably innate, and yet they seem to have a lot of voluntary control over when they produce them, and they can make them they can make them voluntarily, like based on whether they know that the individuals they're trying to inform know about the snake or not. So there's a lot, and like Japanese tits also have alarm calls, and they when receivers hear these alarm calls, it's not just an automatic stimulus response. They actually basically form a mental search image for a snake-like object, and they're more tuned to long, skinny objects moving like a snake than they would be if they hadn't heard that alarm call. So there's a lot more cognitive sophistication involved in these than I think. And so I think it's plausible that language actually evolved out of like mostly innate calls that then became like more and more flexible and more learned over time. And then the brain developed more specialization for learning, but it's not like there was zero learning before. It just got more complex over time. That is just one plausible, hypothesis. But I think, or it could also be that gestures are more important. We just haven't been studying them that much.
Thank you. That's amazing.
Okay, next is Zulema, please.
Yeah, hi. I'm Suleima Tang Martinez. I'm retired from the University of Missouri in St. Louis. And my interest was primarily in social behavior and communication in mammals, primarily rodents. I have a bunch of questions, but some of them I suspect are going to be really, really short. So I'll just go ahead and maybe ask them one by one. Would that be best, Michael?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And by the way, I thought this was a really super cool seminar. I really loved the it's really nice. What about males? Because I think your study was all done with females. Do you know if
Pretty
there's
much,
any?
yeah.
Yeah. Do you know anything about males, or has anybody else worked with males to see whether you have similar patterns?
There are some people working on vocal communication in males. Recently it was discovered that males have let's go rumbles too. So they also kind of discuss whether to move off as a group. They produce rumbles in social contexts. They also have a sort of unique rumble that only male African elephants make, called a must rumble. So when they're in must, which is this sort of heightened sexual state, they produce very distinctive rumbles that serve as like a sexual signal. And yeah, so there hasn't been as much work done on the males, but more and more people are starting to look at them. In my population, like they don't talk that much, and so it makes it kind of hard to get enough recordings of the males to do much with them. But if you're more patient than me, then you can definitely, get a lot of recordings.
Yeah. My second question is, I don't know if this happens or how often it might happen in the wild, but certainly in captivity, you can have individuals that are total strangers who are put together. Do you have any evidence or thoughts about whether in those situations the newcomers like essentially come up with names or learn names for the new individuals that are coming in that are not familiar to them at all?
Yeah, I have no idea. I've absolutely no idea how elephants get their names. With the only situation in which that would be common where new individuals come in is with males, because females are highly philopatric, so they basically stay in their natal group for life. The males will come in from another population. So, assuming that the males have names too, then, that would be a situation in which either they would have to teach their name to the new population or the new population would come up with a name for them. But I have no idea how that works. It's a really interesting question.
Yeah. And you didn't mention this, but I assume that multisensory communication is probably super important in this guys.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's olfactory stuff and tactile and visual as well. Even vibratory communication through the substrate. Yeah,
exactly. And I'm wondering whether in some of the situations that you looked at, that might, if they're communicating in several different ways, if you do a playback and it's just the sound, you might not get a response if there's other communication going on, using other sensory modalities. Because you mentioned that I think it was like 25 or 26% of the interactions, if I understood you correctly, used quote unquote possible labels or names. Was that? Yeah. So I wonder if the reason that's that low is because they're communicating I guess it would be more communicating your own name during these communications by means other than vocalizations.
Potentially, yeah. I think another reason why it's low is because they just wouldn't need to use names in every utterance. Right. Sometimes it's obvious who they're talking to. But yeah, I think there's so much going on that is essentially noise for the purpose of the analysis that it makes it really hard to find patterns, especially when you have a limited sample size. But yeah.
Yeah, and I was even thinking that, if you think of human beings, interacting, you run into somebody and you might say their name, but oftentimes you have a conversation and each person knows who the other person is. And so there's no need really to say their name. And that could be why, it's so low. Yeah. And then the only other comment that I had is that you were talking about it would be good to know if they can refer to an individual who is absent, right? And I was thinking that given that elephants seem to respond so strongly to deaths and so on, that might be the ideal situation where you would, you could think of an elephant has died, and that the other elephants might communicate in such a way that they use that individual's name.
I have thought of that. There actually was an individual who, actually multiple individuals who died during the study. So there was a female who I had recorded calls of some of her family members calling to her. So potentially that's her name. And then she was shot and killed in the middle of the study. But unfortunately, it was not able to get any recordings of the elephants visiting. Like we know they visited the carcass, but it was mostly at night, and we can't go out at night and record.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
One thing I'd love to do in the future is get some autonomous recorders and just put them out by elephant carcasses, and then record calls that are made around the carcass.
That would be super cool. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. And are you pretty confident that, given that they're making this very, very low frequency sounds that we can't hear, are you pretty confident that the equipment that's available is picking all of that up now, or do you have any concerns about whether there may be even more going on than we're able to pick up with what the instruments we have?
I think we're picking up everything.
Okay.
Because the recording equipment goes down to 3 hertz with like very high degree of fidelity, and elephant, like we know what the fundamental frequency of the calls is, because if you measure the distance between the harmonics, that equals the fundamental. So we know the fundamental is like well above the recording limits of the equipment.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much again, and it's a really fascinating talk.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I have 2 more questions in the queue, and I think that will probably be about the amount of time we have, depending on how long they take.
Cool.
But next is Emilio.
Hi. I just had a couple of quick questions. The first one, kind of leading off of that last question about the equipment. I noticed that you mentioned that for the second study, different recording equipment was used just because, they happen at different times.
Right.
Do you think that could have had any influence on the differences found between the two populations, or do you think that, the differences were significant enough that to allocate it to just the populations being different?
So specifically, to address that, we measured the contour of the second harmonic, which has been shown previously to be very robust to differences in the recording equipment. So the fact that we found that we were able to reliably predict population just based on the contour of the second harmonics strongly suggests that it's not due to the recording equipment, that there actually is an acoustic difference in the calls themselves.
Okay, awesome. And then the second thing, I was really interested in the idea of the coo calls being like a method for infants to learn their name.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any ideas for how to move forward with that, those studies?
I think like a longitudinal study would be one way to do it, where we record the coo rumbles made to a calf when they're young, and then maybe like 7 to 10 years later, when they're an older juvenile or like starting to become an adult, see how other individuals refer to them and see if it's basically the same thing. I think what we first need to do is isolate the labels, like figure out what component of the call encodes the label, and then see if that stays the same over time.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, really great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, our last question is from Vincent.
Yes, thank you very much to let me ask a few questions. And it is made in the continuation of Zulema. I've written those questions, but there's this question, that voice for us human beings as an emotional charge, which is very, very important. When one think about some deceased friend and see him again through a photograph, or hearing him again. There's a huge difference in that. Does it make sense? And it's a bit cruel. Does it make sense to have records of deceased elephants and propose them to the elephants some time after, like a few months later, or even few years later, and to see how they do react to it?
So that actually was done once. Karen McComb did a sort of one-off experiment where she played the call of a deceased individual to the family, and the family reacted very strongly, the same way that they would to the call of a current family member. They, approaching the speaker, calling in response. She told me that she would never do that again, because it could cause emotional distress to the elephants. And I would agree with that. I wouldn't do that experiment because I think it's quite probable that it would cause emotional distress to them, and I don't really see any justification for that. But yeah, like based on that one time that it was done, they certainly recognized the call. How they felt about it, we don't know, but it certainly evoked some kind of response.
Okay. So now I will turn back to my questions I announced before. Since it is mostly about rumbles, did you correlate it with seismic waves or seismic signature? Also, you could control the low frequency with geophones there to see that actually it does something when you replay it.
Right. Yeah, so I didn't do that in this study. Some people have. It requires a whole different sort of setup because you have to bury the recorder in the ground, which means you can only record the elephants when they're near your seismic recorder. And I mean, you can also play seismic signals through like a seismic shaker, but again, it's sort of like a whole different experiment to set up by itself.
I don't think so. I think it couples the acoustic waves at those low frequencies. They couple naturally.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
So you don't have to make complicated things, but one needs a control. And a control is made through a geophone, and a geophone is a very little thing, and it works in this very low frequency between 10 to 50 hertz, and you put that on the ground, it's large like that, and you put it, and then you have the signature that effectively, on two ways, when you record it and when you fabricate it, that it goes together.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Definitely might be worth doing that in the future. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your very nice talk. Thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, well, I think we're out of time, so I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Mickey. Thanks for a really interesting talk and
thank you.
A really interesting discussion, of course. For those of you who are coming next week, again, please remember if you're coming from Europe, it's an hour difference. And again, we did send out a survey. We'd like your feedback on that. And so at this point, I'm going